So in this particular Baptist history study, we're focusing more on the Southern Baptist end of that and splits off. There's, of course, broader pictures in many other Baptist groups globally and even in the United States, but we're kind of focusing on the Southern Baptist end of it, so that's mostly what we've been aware of. So last week we ended with the SBC controversy that went on for, I guess the struggles went on for about at least 15 years during that time. And so now we're going to pick up kind of post-struggle, what developed, and then what's going on with SBC and other groups at this time. So let me get, oh, here comes Mike.
I was going to say, you might want to check which connection you're on.
Well, we don't have a, Mike is muted. We don't have a picture, Mike, of you. So I'll keep trying. Okay, let me get this queued up.
There he is.
Oh, there's Mike. You sound very strange, Mike. Okay. All right. Let me get this queued up. Okay. So this section is titled Fallout and Future. What's the fallout of all the SBC struggle, and also what that is now and what the future may look like for these various groups. So I'd like to start first by talking about the formation of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which was one of the larger groups to come out of the Southern Baptist Convention. In 1990, and I remember the whole struggle started in 1979. So for about an 11-year period, this all took place and went on. And hopefully Mike is coming back in. There he is. Hey, Mike, how are you?
Fine. Is that better?
Yeah, that's very, you sounded very strange. We were worried about you.
I think that's a backhanded insult.
Anyway, we've come to what you've been asking about a long time, the formation of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So that's where we're going to start off this evening. So again, this about this long struggle, I guess more accurately about 10 or 11 years, starting in about 1979. In 1990, you have to remember, during this time, there were huge political things going on within the convention. You had meetings of kind of the mainstream Baptists, meeting of the Fundamentalist Baptists. You had get out the vote efforts. You had all these different things going on to get people to the convention to vote. And this was a very intense kind of 10 years back and forth, trying to change the SBC or save the SBC, and that went on. And so in 1990, the more moderate mainstream group made a final attempt to win the presidency. They ran Daniel Vestal, who was pastor of First Baptist Midland, Texas, against Morris Chapman, who is pastor of First Baptist Wichita Falls. I think that's where he was at the time. And Vestal lost 57 to 43. Usually the votes were something like, 52 to 48%, something like that. So by this time, people were really tired of fighting, especially on the mainstream end. They were very tired of going, and it wasn't in their nature to fight. So that was kind of part of it. So being tired of all this, mainstream Baptists called for a gathering of disaffected SBCers in Atlanta in 1991. And I happened to attend that meeting. And it was a really interesting meeting. It was in downtown Atlanta at the World Congress Center in that area. And those who gathered, and I was among them, weren't certain what was going to happen. Some were there to start a new denomination. Some were there to try to figure out how to keep fighting in the SBC. And so there was a lot of back and forth over what the group was going to be and to do. It was just mainly people who didn't agree with the direction of the SBC over the past 10 years. The group probed the names Cooperative Baptist Convention. I think they found there was another Cooperative Baptist Convention registered name, so they turned away from that. They also talked about the fellowship being a name, but eventually they settled on the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, or CBF. So again, that was sort of in the 91, 92 time that this group formed. Now, initially, CBF was mainly a funding channel for SBC causes. In other words, you sent your money to SBC and or to CBF rather, and CBF would channel that money in certain ways. For example, it would channel more to the Foreign Mission Board. It would channel more to the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs or whatever. But it would, the Southern Baptist Convention had its own funding formula, and the CBF would send it by different funding formula, and it would defund certain entities within the Southern Baptist Convention. So that was the initial model of CBF as a funding channel for SBC causes. It was not an independent entity in itself, really. Although it had various plans. I don't know, 3, 4, 5 plans that a church could give to that would distribute the money in different ways. And in some of those plans, some of those monies went into a CBF fund itself outside Southern Baptist Convention. But in 1994, the SBC voted not to receive money through entities like CBF, so that role ended. SBC said, we'd rather not have your money than have you channel it the way you want to send it. So that's the way they did. Another thing, the SBC did other things. For example, if your church wanted to just designate it for Foreign Mission Board, the SBC would reduce the Foreign Mission Board's budget or cooperative program money by that amount. So it was very difficult to circumvent the SBC funding formula. Although you could send all your money to Lottie Moon and you could kind of go around it that way, but that wasn't super desirable either. So this sort of funding channel role ended about 1994. So that the CBF called its leader their coordinator. And the first was Cecil Sherman, famous in this area from First Baptist Asheville. I think by that time he was at a church in Fort Worth and had retired from that and became the first coordinator of CBF. And the current coordinator is Paul Baxley. And so we'll talk more about where its headquarters are. So the CBF is, we talked earlier about mission societies where you joined as an individual or as a church, whereas a convention you join as a church. Well, the CBF has both of those qualities. You can participate in CBF either by donating through the church donates, so members of that church can participate, or if you as an individual donate to CBF, you can participate. So it has that sort of older society flavor to it. Also, in addition to that, we'll talk about states in a moment, but state CBF organizations have developed in many states, including North Carolina. So we're one of those states that have a state CBF. So the CBF has an annual meeting called the General Assembly that meets usually about around late June, somewhere around that time. They try to avoid meeting on Southern Baptist Convention usually meets about the second week of June, and CBF meets in later June normally. So that's their annual gathering where they do a lot of their business. They have, the SBC had the executive committee that handles business between conventions. The CBF has a coordinating council that handles business between general assemblies. So that's the CBF structure. Again, CBF headquarters is in Atlanta. North Carolina CBF headquarters is in Winston-Salem. So that Larry Hovis is head of North Carolina CBF. We also have something a bit unique in the CBF family. We have a Western North Carolina Baptist Fellowship called WNCBF, which functions kind of like a Baptist association. And yours truly is coordinator of that group. And it's kind of like, again, I would call it association, but very churches that participate in it span all the way from Franklin, Bryson City, all the way nearly to Charlotte. So we have a variety of churches involved in that. And the function, not all of you were here when we started, but the barbecue and bluegrass function next Sunday night is from this WNCBF group. And basically it functions to help fund local missions. For example, this group helps fund college ministry, student ministry at UNCA, at Mars Hill, and at Western. So we have one person, a guy named David Stone, who does Baptist ministry at all those schools. Interestingly, the State Baptist Convention has gotten out of that kind of ministry, so they don't do that anymore. So that's funded that way. So those are kind of the entities that developed out of CBF. CBF has, the way it's structured, again, General Assembly has a global missions entity that does mission work in North America and the world. CBF went a bit different model from SBC. SBC, classically has the Home Missions or North American Missions Board, and then the International Missions Board, which works overseas. So NAM, as it's called, works in the US, whereas IMB operates internationally. But CBF has gone with a different concept of the idea of people groups. You minister to people groups. For example, you might minister to Slavics in Asheville, Ukrainians or whatever in Asheville and in Ukraine. So it's sort of like where this people group is. And so there's not a division between North American and international missions in the CBF look, which is an interesting way to look at it. Also, CBF itself has no educational entities. It looked at, when CBF was first formed, the question of theological education came up. In other words, we don't really like what's being taught at these Southern Baptist seminaries anymore. So what do we do with that? But starting educational or starting institutions is enormously expensive and eats up a lot of resources. So what CBF decided to do was help with scholarships for students to go to different schools. And we'll talk in a moment how the different theological schools, for example, they'll help, let's say they might fund a Christy Hollifield to go to Gardner-Webb Divinity, or a student at the Baptist House of Studies at Duke. So, there's just, they decided that was a better way to go about funding theological education than other routes, although that gets kind of sticky, sometimes over some of these schools. But they're either, and we'll talk more about this, but you have we'll talk about all the divinity schools that have formed, but also different schools like, for example, Candler in Atlanta and Emory, they have a Baptist house of study. Duke has a Baptist house of study within that group. So there's that. Because of all the SBC controversies, the CBF has no statement of faith. There's not a confession of faith, although there are various policy statements that relate to doctrinal ideas. And of course, those who work CBF are trained or are asked theological questions, things like that. CBF affirms women in ministry. That's pretty universal across CBF, although not all CBF churches say have women deacons or necessarily would approve it, but as a body, CBF affirms women in ministry. On the homosexual issue, gay issue, it's kind of a broader field there. There are some CBF churches that both welcome and affirm homosexuals. For example, First Baptist Asheville and other groups other churches that do that. The CBF as a whole does not. In other words, a practicing homosexual cannot serve as a field personnel missionary. But a few years ago, CBF did allow the hiring of homosexuals in certain non-ministerial positions, like support secretaries, basically, positions like that. So there are some differences there, but as we'll talk about controversies, that will be and continues to be an ongoing controversy, as you have some churches who want CBF to be more conservative, others who want them to be more liberal. So there's sort of that tug of war within there. So I know I covered a good bit real quickly on CBF. Anybody, again, it mainly comes out of the SBC controversy. It's a different animal in that it's more of a society form versus a convention form. Most CBF churches are like us in that they're what we might call dually aligned. They participate both with Southern Baptist Convention and CBF. There are very few pure CBF churches, although First Baptist Canton is now, and various other churches. And kind of back to our Western North Carolina group, it came about because CBF wanted to help sponsor a mission in the Hendersonville area. And in fact, the way I think I heard it started, the pastor at First Baptist Hendersonville said, we've got all these uncondented Southern Baptists who want to start a church. So can we start a church with them? So First Baptist Hendersonville, this group came out of First Baptist Hendersonville and started what we call Providence Baptist. But Buncombe Association would not accept them because they were going to be a pure CBF church. So this group initially formed to help support Providence Baptist, who eventually had a woman pastor, actually. Gail Coulter became pastor of that church down in Hendersonville. So, but Buncombe Association rejected it because it was CBF only, that was before women even came into the picture. So, and also we have other churches that were thrown out of their associations, like, various ones, and because of, say, having women pastors or whatever. And others that just don't, just didn't feel edified by their association. So our church allows members to give to CBF if they want to, for their global money, their outside the church money. And also a portion of that goes to our WNCBF group as well. So that's kind of how that functions. But CBF as a whole is obviously a much smaller entity than Southern Baptist Convention. And we'll talk more about the future of those in a moment. But anybody have any questions about, does that answer some of your questions, Mike, about CBF and when it formed? You're muted, Mike, I think.
Yes, it did. I know that there was an issue about women submit themselves to their husbands that involved. Yeah.
That came in the Baptist Faith and Message by Southern Baptist Convention, Baptist Faith and Message of 98, where that was put into that document.
Yeah.
And so that kind of that's one of the things that prompted your church to pull out.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. The church that we were charter members of, that was one of the issues with us. So they went from the SBC to the CBF.
Mhm.
That was a general consensus of members of the church.
Mhm.
But we continued and stayed there with the church regardless until we moved to Sumter. And then we were in Sumter for about 17 years and came up here, but we've been with CBF, SBC ever since we moved to Sumter.
So again, that's sort of a lot of churches were going through that. Again, a very small percentage of churches completely withdrew from SBC. As we'll see in a moment, all these groups are declining. So the SBC is declining, CBF is declining, all these various churches are dealing with issues related to that. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But again, there are very few only CBF only churches. There's a lot of SBC only churches, but there aren't a whole lot of churches that are only CBF.
Yeah. Are you going to address when we did our study back in the early 90s?
I was going to say, Judy, if you want, you know more.
Well,
I think
I would
that was
just say
about in this
Yes,
time around
in that
91.
time frame.
I think that
Our-
our church did a study,
Yeah.
correct?
Our pastor, we listened for years during the 80s. Dr. Garner
Was that Dr.
would go
Garner?
to the conventions and come back just in a grievous state of despair about what's happening. And I can remember before he came to our church, he was pastor of First Baptist Church, Brunswick. And Dr. Garner was a leader with Georgia Baptist serving in huge ways. Before he went to First Baptist Brunswick, he was at Murray Hills in Jacksonville. And he attended a meeting in the mid 70s when the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Jacksonville had brought a lot of people, a lot of pastors from all over the Southeast together to talk about what they wanted to do at the convention.
Right.
And he was brokenhearted at that time that this political session was actually happening in Baptist life. So he comes to our church, and through the years, he tried his best. But I remember him coming, back and sharing. And so he retired he resigned in 92. At that time, our church was debating, CBF had come into play, and there were people who wanted to support CBF. So a committee was appointed, as Baptists do, and there is not one person left who served on that committee. There was a young man who moved to Raleigh. He worked for Steve. I can't think of his last name, but anyway, he worked for the office out here on Raccoon Road. But anyway, but I remember my John served on that, and Catherine Kirkpatrick and Dot Evans, Dr. Arentz, and I don't remember the rest, but they worked hard going to visit churches and dealing with this issue. How would we do this? And so they brought a motion to the church early, I believe it was in 93. I've got the motion and all that somewhere in my stuff. And the church voted to allow church members who wanted to support CBF. And that's why you have that option on your envelope today. The church voted to do that in 93.
That was pretty early in that struggle.
Yeah.
And actually, I think we've had at least 3 denominational studies and have ended up the same place.
Yes, yeah.
Time.
What
Which-
was Norm Gardner, his first name, Norman?
No,
Hugh.
Hugh. You may
Okay.
be thinking, okay. But yeah, so the church ended up at the same place. We have had obviously time struggle with folks who wanted to get rid of CBF, who feel uncomfortable with that.
You know, we call it partnering. We partner with both. You choose.
Right, and that I think that's what I've tried to say to our churches. These are mission partnerships. These are,
Exactly.
and that's what they are.
Yeah.
We partner with SBC, we partner with CBF, we partner with Hayward Christian Ministry, we partner with Downtown, all these different entities. We are primarily First Baptist Waynesville. That's who we are, and so we partner with who we feel led to partner with. And actually, right now, Faith tells me most of our people give to the FBC only. That's what they designate mostly for FBC only versus SBC or CBF. So then that kind of leads us to craft what we feel led is our mission program, and that helps fund mission trips and things like that. So
I think
go ahead.
I think the reason that has developed that way, even back in the time period that Judy's talking about, because Myra and I joined somewhere around 90 or just before that. And I think the church has always wanted people to be open to do how they, to follow their conscience. And so, I know that led us to vote the way we did in those times. But and I think that's the way I would characterize our church from the years that we've been there. They want people to get along, one thing, but they want them to follow their own conscience in terms of supporting whichever, SBC, CBF, and they are smart enough to figure out for themselves how their money ought to go. And so I think that was what has driven the votes, but out of all that, what year, Judy, did we vote on women deacons?
Are you talking about the first time?
Well,
in 98?
yeah.
And
90, I guess in that.
it was 98,
It was
99.
before my time. The first time was before I came.
Yeah. It was 55%. 55% of the vote was to do it. And a motion was made just before the vote that it had to be 2/3.
Right.
And so that church was packed on a Sunday night. And it had to be 65%. It was 55%. So it did not. And that was when Jack Bishop was our pastor.
Right.
And he came in 93, and he was very supportive of CBF as well. But anyway, and one thing that I really think, Robert, you said something at the end of last Sunday. The direction was not doctrinal conformity that was the direction.
It was not, the direction was
rather than missions.
Right.
And our missions team is its purpose is dealing with all the partners that we give to, in addition to special offerings. And I think that is real important. Tom does a good job of pulling people together, and anybody can come to that meeting, not just, anybody. And I think we need to remind people when that meeting happens, if you have an interest and you want to know where our money goes, they need to come to that meeting. And so, because that's before you deal with it in the budget. Yeah. Anyway, that's how it got involved.
I pointed to the women's deacon vote and as kind of being the end of that, the decisions that came out of the CBF SBC division, the wars of the 90s and all that. I think it kind of led to the funding avenues that we have as a church now. It culminated in the women's deacon election. And, post that, we've fiddled with the funding sources some, but I think a lot of that has been fairly well set since that. The last big controversial thing to me, I think, was the women's deacon. And I thought the church handled it well. I mean, even the vote that we didn't pass it the first time, the concern was that we had a strong majority that would support. And if in that first vote it wasn't a strong enough majority. So we waited and we did it again later, and in that time it passed. So to me, I think it was over that period of time that our church was kind of dealing with all those issues and have now moved past them and have kind of defined who we are.
Right.
And I think that's the way I see it anyway.
Yeah. It was 15 years later when our church voted for women deacons. But that process, the 2011 situation, that was also part of dealing with who we are. And
Right.
I know some of us sitting here remember that Sunday in April of 2011, and that was huge vote by the church
Right.
to keep being who we are.
Yeah. But it was, it took years. It was it was something that God worked out over time.
Yeah.
And, sometimes when people push to make change rapidly,
It
doesn't
won't
go
happen.
so well.
Yeah.
I think we moved just about the right speed, in my opinion.
Yeah. And one other thing while we're kind of talking about this, when I served on our state WMU board, I learned that, the Baptist State Convention stopped funding, or they didn't ever fund WMU, but they gave us a portion of the North Carolina missions offering every year. And we helped raise the money for that offering. And so they decided that we would not get that offering anymore. So we had to change how we worked. We had to find sources. And CBF of North Carolina has funds, not only WMU, but Baptist Children's Home. And who else, Robert? There's several other entities in North Carolina that are strong.
Retirement home, children's
yeah,
home.
Yeah. And CBF North Carolina supports them financially. So when you give them money, so that's huge too.
Hospital system gives a little money to hospital systems for chaplains and things like that. So,
Anyway.
so it was, it is just, it was not fun to go through all that, but
no.
And I went to just about all those controversial conventions, and it was just a huge distraction. And it's we'll kind of talk about where it all ends up in a moment, but that's where it was. And again, many churches just didn't do anything. Other churches participated in CBF. Some individual church members participate in CBF, or we'll talk about another entity or two in a moment that are out there, but that, and I think our church has done a good job dealing with all of that and understanding who Baptists are. But I think, as you can see from the changes in the Baptist Faith and Message statements, the role of women has been a huge deal. And to this day is a huge deal for the Southern Baptist Convention. It's kind of a do or die issue, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's go on. So another group out there, which is not as large as certainly as SBC or even CBF, is called the Alliance of Baptists. Just want to let you to know a bit about them. The Southern Baptist Alliance formed in 1987. It's now known as the Alliance of Baptists. It engages in missions and other ministries. The Alliance of Baptists affirms both women in ministry and welcome and affirm gays. So it would be the kind of farthest to to the liberal end of all these groups. So it is a smaller group, but there are a number of churches that participate in that. So if you hear about the Alliance of Baptists, you know who they are. So the SBC is split, but the splits also came down to the State Baptist Convention level. In the 1990s, the SBC controversy had increasing effects in state Baptist conventions. The first split occurred in Virginia, with fundamentalists leaving the Baptist General Association of Virginia. That's their state convention name. And that was the first split on the state level that occurred. And then the second split, which I witnessed, was in Texas, with the Southern Baptists of Texas leaving the Baptist General Convention of Texas. So Virginia Baptist Convention and Texas Baptist Convention were more mainstream, less fundamentalist type. It was interesting in Texas. Texas people were very conservative, but somehow they had this pioneering thing that you're not going to tell me what to do. You're not going to tell me what to believe. So Texas was as much a rebellion against kind of the authoritarianism of SBC, more so than really any much theological difference. The third split occurred in Missouri, with, again, moderate conservatives breaking off from the Missouri Baptist Convention. So in some cases, like Virginia and Texas, you have more fundamentalist elements breaking off from the state convention. In Missouri, you have more moderate mainstream people breaking off from the Missouri Baptist Convention and forming their own conventions. Now, in other states like Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, instead of forming their own state conventions, mainstream Baptists gravitate to state CBF groups. So in other words, instead of forming their own convention, they just gravitated to CBF. Interestingly, at least when I left Texas, CBF was not very strong there on a state level, because the state convention was still pretty mainstream, but that is changing there, even there. So, but again, in Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and other states, they more, again, mainstream moderate people went to state CBF groups. Another thing that's happened as I alluded to earlier, all these new educational institutions. In addition to controversy on state levels, there has been an explosion of Baptist seminaries since the early 1990s. In 1985, there were 6 Southern Baptist Convention seminaries. We call them the 6 Sisters. And they were located everywhere from Southern in Louisville, Southeastern here in North Carolina, Midwestern, I think in Kansas City and New Orleans, down in New Orleans, Southwestern in Texas, and Golden Gate out in San Francisco. So those were the 6 sisters, and there were no state seminaries at all. No, for example, when I was coming up, none of us entertained any thought of going to any kind of seminary other than a Southern Baptist one that back in, say, 1977, back during that time. But today there's still the 6 sisters, but there are at least 10 other Baptist seminaries, divinity schools, and Baptist houses of study. And there are, well, there used to be 2, now there's 1 in Texas, Truett Seminary at Baylor. Here, there are divinity schools at Campbell, at Gardner-Webb. Of course, you got Wake Forest, and there are probably some others in there that I can't name off the top of my head. Yeah, well, and you've got the Baptist houses of study at Duke, and then there's one at Candler. You got McAfee Seminary, which is off of Mercer in Georgia. So there are all these different new divinity schools that have popped up for people who don't want it, because the Southern Baptist seminaries became more and more fundamentalist. And whereas I mentioned earlier, when I taught at Southwestern, I signed the Southwestern Statement of Faith. Well, now they've, again, back to this doctrinal conformity. Now all the seminary professors must sign the latest version, whatever that is, of the Baptist Faith and Message. So you, in other words, to teach at a Southern Baptist seminary, you have to teach against women in ministry and things of that nature. At Southwestern, the president there wouldn't allow a woman to teach theology, even though she did not teach any anti-women stuff at all. Is a person I knew, Karen Bullock. She got fired just because she was a woman teaching theology. You shouldn't even have women teaching theology to males anyway. So again, there's all this explosion of divinity schools, seminaries, and again, CBF and other entities help fund those, but it's made for young people, it's made seminaries much more expensive. And then you have kids going to like, Kaylee went to Trinity up in Chicago. You have kids go to Fuller in California, but some of those are really expensive. Even the Baptist schools are very expensive. And that's a real problem today, in that a lot of younger people are coming out of seminary with a huge debt, a huge school debt, and they have a hard time paying that off once they get out into ministry. So that's a real issue today. So any questions about the all these new educational institutions? Again, the one closest to us is the Divinity School at Gardner-Webb, where Christy went, and all of us have heard that Mitch is leaving. It's interesting, the whole staff where Mitch is going at First Baptist Dalton, all the staff there except for Mitch went to one of these new schools like McAfee or these other institutions. So that's a real change for churches. Yes, Mike.
How long is seminary?
That's a good question. Now, I don't know how it is now. For me, Master Divinity is the first level. In my time, if you went full time, it took you 3 years to get it. So it's longer. Many schools, if you go full time, like you get an MBA in probably a year or something like that. Whereas
seminary, how do you get into it?
Very easy. Seminaries have very low entrance requirements. You basically, they do have some entrance requirements. Well, if you want to get a master's, you got to have a Bachelor of Arts from an accredited school. So that we got to have a bachelor degree from an accredited college or university. There is not, at least when I was there, there's no entrance test or really grade point average you need. So it's a pretty low bar to get into. And you also though need usually a recommendation from the church, your church saying this is a good person and we recommend this person, who we affirm this person's call to ministry and feel that again that this person is called to the Lord, and our church would support this person. Supports this person going to seminary.
So you have to have a bachelor's degree first.
Well, again, it gets complicated because some seminaries, particularly the Southern Baptist seminaries, have what they call diploma programs, where you come in and you don't have a bachelor's, but you get what they call a diploma. So that takes a year or two to do that, but it's not a true master's degree, but it's designed for people who maybe are, and most of the diploma students that I saw at Southwestern were people coming out, older guys coming out of the military, things like that. So they came about it that way. So it's kind of a complicated picture, but yeah, that's basically it. And of course, like now again with say Gardner-Webb Divinity, I'm sure they require a BA or something like that, a bachelor's degree to get in. Whereas again, all the Southern Baptist seminaries anyway have what they call a diploma program, and I think they call it something else now, but it's designed for people without that. Interestingly, at the Southern Baptist seminaries, a woman cannot get a Master of Divinity because that involves preaching, and they don't believe women should preach.
Right.
So they do get, I don't know what they call it. They do get a master's, but it's not a Master of Divinity.
Where does Fruitland and places like that fall into?
Fruitland is designed for people without a bachelor's degree. It's sort of that diploma type program. It's not accredited. It's more kind of on a college level, almost more like a junior college level. But that's what Fruitland, I think, that's a North Carolina institution, isn't it, Judy?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's in Hendersonville, but that's through the state convention, and that's designed again. And I don't think you even get. Maybe you do. I don't think you get a real college bachelor's coming out of it, but it's designed for people without bachelor's degree to get a basic kind of theological education. But a lot of ministers around here have been to Fruitland.
Right.
Yes. Yep.
Any other questions about schools? Schools are important because they do mold ministers and their theology and all that.
Well, I think, everything that went on.
I know one thing.
Everything that went on with SBC did make some of these other schools more important to kids. Like Kaylee, Kaylee was not going to go to an SBC after a lot of what they, the way they did things. And I guess because she heard us complain about it, but but they have, just at Trinity, they had excellent staff, people who were recognized as experts in various fields, and that appealed to her more than she didn't want to go where politics were being a part of involved. And that was really what made a big
difference.
difference.
I know people joined our church who wanted to go to a certain seminary, and they felt like if they were a member of our church, it would help their chances of getting in that seminary. I also know someone who left our church to join a much more fundamentalist church to get in Southeastern. And that was, yeah. So yeah, I'm old, but that wasn't really all that long ago. That's been in the last.
Well, I was going to say that's got to be in the last 10, 15 years.
Yes. Well, and sometime later I'll tell you who it was, but
I would like to know who that was, but
you know
them. Yeah, and so, but kind of coming back to Mike's question, the bar to get in, the bar to get it. Were you saying something, Donna?
No.
Okay.
Said, I had walked outside to see if I could get pre-Lily in for the night, and they see me, so they know that they're due a treat.
Okay. So anyway, that it's but all this is very important again because you mold ministers, you affect churches through that, and so that's why. And interestingly, what going way back to Paul Pressler and his starting the takeover thing, what he was upset was about stuff taught at Baylor, not at a seminary. Although at the end, Baylor, since Baylor's not a Southern Baptist institution, Baylor ended up unaffected basically by all of that. So that's where that is. Well, let's continue on. Let's talk about other kind of ongoing controversies that have continued going forward. And some of you were part of or heard the report I gave on the sexual assault charges, but I'll recap those very quickly to put it in this context. So for, I don't know, at least 10 to 20 years, the convention has faced continued accusations of cover-ups of sexual assault. Those have occurred on different levels. Some have been at churches, some have been in SBC institutions, different places, but an unwillingness to deal with sexual assault in particular, and worse, to cover those up, to let ministers go. A minister might get let go of a certain church, not know why, get on with another church and commit assault or things like that at a different church. So that sort of thing has gone on. So in 2021, the SBC formed a task force to address those concerns. And there was a big struggle about that. The Southern Baptist leadership, particularly the executive committee, that group that governs the convention between conventions, really resisted an external investigation. They wanted an investigation that they could control. So they really fought against that, and it took a long time. In fact, it looked like the SBC told the executive committee to do this. The executive committee fought not to do it. It would be like our church voted to tell the AOT to do something, and AOT said, we're not going to do it. Because like in our church, the ultimate authority is with the congregation, not with the deacons or the AOT or whoever. So congregational authority trumps all other authorities. And it's the same thing in the SBC, except the SBC annual meeting is the ultimate authority versus it. So anyway, but they finally agreed to it. And so at this last summer, the task force brought its report to the SBC. Report found many disturbing reports of cover-ups of sexual assault in SBC institutions and churches. And kind of related to this, in 2018, remember the two main leaders of the takeover were Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler. In 2018, Patterson was fired as president of Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth because of mishandling of reports of sexual assault. Also, apparently he mishandled reports when he was president at Southeastern Seminary before that, and had mishandled some reports there. So there was a long history of that with Patterson. Paul Pressler was also sued for sexually abusing teenagers, and that lawsuit is still pending. So there's still a pending lawsuit by at least one person against Paul Pressler for sexually abusing him when he was a teenager. Pressler was at, I think, First Baptist Houston, attended there. And so I will say there's always been a lot of smoke around Pressler in terms of something going on there. I didn't think that it was teenagers, but again, that was there. Interestingly, they had put stained glass windows in Southwestern Seminary honoring Patterson and Pressler, but they were removed a couple of years ago. So those were taken out. So you got those going on. As these controversies developed, a backlash group formed called the Conservative Baptist Network. So you already have a very conservative Southern Baptist Convention. And so now you have the Conservative Baptist Network formed. And the CBN opposed the treatment of Paige Patterson and accused the SBC of liberalism and wokeness. Coming from, they didn't like it that the SBC apologized for things like racism and things of that nature, and gave credence to kind of institutional racism, that racism is baked into society, and things like that. So they haven't liked that. And Paige Patterson remains very popular in certain Southern Baptist circles. The CBN has a heavy Calvinist bent and is extremely opposed to women in ministry. That's something that's very upsetting to them, and is really just a central core concern. Going beyond inerrancy, I mentioned there's a new catchphrase. The new catchphrase is the sufficiency of Scripture, which on the surface is not bad. It basically means that you don't need anything beyond the Scriptures to live the life of faith. However, it can lead to rejection of scientific findings. For example, let's say we're reading about demon possession. Let's say we're talking about King Saul. King Saul, the scripture says, is visited by a dark spirit from the Lord. And when this dark spirit descends, he starts acting crazy. So looking at that from kind of a modern scientific technique or perspective, we might say that Saul was suffering from depression or maybe schizophrenia or something like that. And that's just the only way they knew how to describe that. Well, someone who really holds to the sufficiency of scripture would say that's wrong. We got to hold to demonic possession or to this dark spirit from the Lord or whatever in doing that. So again, right now, even now within the convention, there is this formation of this conservative Baptist network, which is trying to push the convention in an even more conservative direction, to be even less tolerant than it is, and to be more affirming of Calvinism and less concerned about racial reconciliation and things of that nature. And it's fairly strong in this area. We have a number of local pastors who are involved in that CBN. Any questions about that? Okay. Wrapping up, kind of, I'm not a real good prognosticator, but what we looked at all this history, what does it look like going forward? Now, as you know, the general scene in America for organized religion is not good. There's declines across the boards in every faith. It's just a matter of, or every Christian group. It is slower in some, faster in others, but we're in this context in which really the fastest growing faith segment in America are called the nones, with no faith, no organized faith at all. So, or at least no participation in any kind of church or religious entity. So the SBC I think will continue to fracture and decline, because it seems like there's somebody who always thinks they're not conservative enough. So I think there's going to be that continued thing. And also the other trend is, even for people who are Christians, fewer of them identify denominationally. And so, for example, Biltmore Baptist is now Biltmore Church. They dropped Baptist from their name. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is the word Baptist is a negative now for a lot of people. And even for other Christians, it's a barrier. So you got Biltmore Baptist, kind of one of the faster growing churches here in Hayward County is the Orchard. It's a Southern Baptist church, but it doesn't have Baptist in its name. So you've got the big decline of all Christian evangelical groups and Catholics and all others. And then you've got the decline within the Christian family, you have the decline of denominational churches also. Now, I don't think all denominational churches will go away. I do think that there'll come a day when the most common expression of Christianity in America will be a non-denominational church. I think that's where things are going, unless they really turn around. I think the CBF will remain stable, but is likely to decline also as denominationalism and church attendance decline. I do think that CBF organizationally is more fit for the future because of the society method. You can participate as an individual or as a church, and it may be more attractive to younger people. I think SBC churches will show greater independence and creativity in missions funding. As I know, and it's great, Tom Tom told us that they took in a record amount of money for Lottie Moon last year, and that's wonderful. And our church gave a great amount to Lottie Moon, and that's wonderful. But the overall picture is decline in that kind of giving, and decline in denominational giving, particularly on the state level. For example, the State Baptist Convention in Georgia has just nearly collapsed. It's sold its building. It once took up a whole big building. Now it's like one floor in one building. And it's just from cutbacks, from churches not giving that way. More churches, are keeping money in the church, kind of what we're doing, spending missions in other ways versus going through the denominational channels.
Right.
State conventions, Baptist associations, even churches will probably continue to splinter over SBC issues. I think that the splintering will just continue as different groups go in different ways. Second generation SBC seeker style megachurches will lose their. In other words, right, like Saddleback, let's take that as an example. That's the big church in California where Rick Warren is. That's now going into a second generation phase. Rick Warren is retiring. So the question is, will that church maintain its Southern Baptist ties in this next generation? And my guess is they're not, because they haven't been raised in that tradition. Rick Warren was the son of a Southern Baptist director of missions. So he had that background and that tie to Southern Baptist Convention. I think that this next generation will not have that identity as much because they weren't raised with RAs and GAs and all those things. Churches will find greater challenges in finding qualified staff. It may be that they have to do more homework. I was talking to Mickey earlier today that when in the search for me, basically you still had the 6 seminaries and you could kind of basically tell what kind of person you're getting from the seminary that person went to. Well, now you've got so many different schools and backgrounds, it's going to take more work to discern what this person is. Mission agencies will have greater challenges in maintaining a mission force. One of the generational changes is interesting. More younger people are interested in doing international missions than, say, my generation was. That's the good news. The bad news is fewer of them see it as a lifetime vocation. In other words, they see themselves doing international missions for 5, 10 years and then doing something else, but they don't really see it as a lifetime calling. And in talking to Tom and people with IMB, which is probably still the largest international mission agency in the world, they're having huge problems with turnover and leadership because so many are just staying for a short time and then getting out of missions. SBC mission agencies will engage in more partnerships with non-SBC entities. And so I do think that SBC will struggle. CBF also think will struggle, not over, I think there's a broad consensus in women and CBF about women in ministry. The stickier issue now in CBF is over the gay issue, over how to come to consensus on that. So I think that's going to be a continuing issue. And as I said, some people think CBF needs to be more conservative, others more liberal, and it's just a pretty diverse group. So there's going to be that struggle going on as well. So I hope this has all helped you kind of see the Baptist context and where a lot of these things go back in history, and maybe sort of a review of what it is to be Baptist. And I appreciate our church in that I think it by and large understands that and understands that we are who we are and we partner as God leads us to partner. So any questions about, I know through it, yes, Mike. You're muted, Mike.
Some people like that. Okay, I got 2 questions.
Okay.
What Judy said earlier about women deacons, the church voted initially for women deacons, and it was declined. And about what, 10 years later, they
15 years later.
15 years later, there obviously been a number of events that probably changed a lot of people's minds and occasions that happened within the church, that all of a sudden we have women deacons. But at the same time, let me ask you, when did our church decide to have women ministers? Well, is Christy the first one?
Christy is the first ordained woman we've had on staff. Although I think, didn't y'all ordain a woman?
We
way
did.
back
Anna Marie
time?
Nobeck. Anna Marie Nobeck was ordained in the late 80s, and that was not announced to the world. I got kind of tickled. I thought, Dr. Goddard, you're not going to tell the Mountaineer.
Well, was
But
she more
anyway,
like a chaplain or something?
she was a chaplain in South Carolina, and I wonder where she is today. Haven't heard about from Anna Marie in a long time. Yeah.
Okay.
And we have had the occasional women preacher preach at our church.
Yes.
So by and large, I've not noticed any problem with it. So I think in our church, we have a broad consensus on, I mean, we still have some in our church who are against women deacons and will not nominate a woman or vote for a woman to serve as a deacon, but that's a very small percentage of, I would say that's probably 4 or 5 people in the church who feel that way. And I've not had any backlash from the church anyway about Christy being ordained or about we had Rebecca Mathis preach back in the summer, and of course Christy Hollifield and Christy Huskisson preached years ago. So we've not had any. Now we did lose when we did finally vote to have women deacons. We lost several families over that, several couples, not a large amount, but we did lose some over that who did. And still we've had a few leave over CBF, or we back to women. We had I think one Sunday morning we had a video testimony of a woman deacon, and then Christy got up and did the announcements, and we had a family walk out after that. So
on the back, they were in the back.
Yeah.
They were visitors.
They were visitors. So anyways, and we are, but again, we're not alone in having women deacons as Baptist churches. First Baptist Canton has them. I think First Baptist Clyde does, and various others. So, but they're, I know in our Baptist Association, there's a definite concern about women preachers and pastors. Go ahead, Mike.
I was up front when that family, I think it was man and woman, I can't remember if they had 1 or 2 kids. When they came in, they were excited to come in and everything. But when they found out that we had women deacons, they couldn't wait to get out.
Yeah.
But my other question.
They were from Johnson City. They were visitors. Yeah,
Yes.
that's where they were from.
They were. My other question is, since a lot of people are falling away from going to church, would you say a lot of that is influenced by today's political atmosphere and wokeness?
I think that's complicated. I think one thing, COVID, I think what COVID did is it accelerated existing trends. In other words, church attendance was kind of doing, for not just us, but all churches, was kind of doing this before COVID. And then COVID kind of made it do this, kind of steepen that curve of decline. I hear more, as I run into people in the fitness center, I run into former Catholics, former Baptists, and they express being turned off, not by the wokeness, but by the lack of wokeness. They're turned off by the church not being accepting enough of, say, gay people or having a very authoritarian stance on things. That's kind of what I hear from people who've dropped out. So I think that that people who drop out tend to drop out for different reasons. Some it's more people have boats and vacation houses and all that stuff, and not that I'm knocking those things, but that, you know, it's just there are more distractions. And I think too, we now had a couple generations, like my generation, like, you know, at least 80% of people seems like went to church and took their kids to church. And then with the baby boomers, that percentage dropped, as a lot of my generation said, well, I was made to go to church, I'm not going to make my kids go to church. So then you have a drop off there. And then you have this growing group of people who've never been to church and aren't really interested and don't see a need for it. I know Mitch would tell me about meeting parents, you know, his peers at ball games and stuff like that. And he talked to them about church, and they're like, what do I need with church? You know, I just don't need it. And I'm fine with my life. I'm happy. I'm good. And who needs church? So there's just a combination of things there. But I think that, I do think that people, again, probably a number of people have dropped out of church because of political pronouncements at church, and churches being outspoken in politics. I think that that's been very damaging to a number of people.
I think people have, you know, they're sick of politics, you know, on television, in the news. They're bombarded by it. They don't want it at church, you know, and church is, in my opinion, is an inappropriate place for politics. But, you know, the denominational wars that Roberts talked about last week and this week to some degree, you know, that the kids who are my kids' age, they grew up in, if they went to church, they grew up in households where, if you were in Baptist life anyway, and involved at all, you were, you know, you heard about all that, you read about it. You were, you know, people like me were turned off by the controversy, the constant controversy within the denomination. And so I think that, you know, that probably trickled over to what our kids heard, you know, but it also, I don't think they don't think politics has a place in church. And, you know, and now we have church being involved in politics, you know, so you get, you know, you listen to the media, and the right wing side of politics in our country is primarily evangelical Christians. And whether that is or is not true, I don't know, but I think that's the biggest turnoff for young people today than anything, is the idea that there is a mixture of church and state. I think that concerns them and is a turnoff for them. And I don't know, you know, I don't know if it's actually true, but I think that's one of the bigger issues. I don't even know what wokeness means. I think it's one of those ridiculous terms that people like to use, that because nobody really knows what they mean when they use the term.
Well, I think it's sort of, yeah, that's true. But I think you're right on point, Mickey. I think that a lot of younger people, and now evangelical in our country is now associated with right-wing politics, for better or worse. So another interesting phenomenon is that we have a growing group now called identified as evangelicals who don't go to church, which is interesting to me. They identify as evangelical, but they don't go to church. So it's interesting that evangelicals who don't go to church are more likely to be Christian nationalists than evangelicals who do go to church. So it's sort of interesting how all that has played out. But again, young people are turned off by that. They're turned off by what they see as hypocrisy. And while they have different opinions on, say, homosexuality being gay, even if they may see homosexuality as sinful, they're turned off by the very bitter anti, you know, the really gay hatred that they see from some churches. That because the difference is, younger people are more likely to know an actual gay person than older people are. So that's one reason why their understanding of that is different. And so even though they might be pretty conservative, they don't go with I would say the very hateful kind of gay talk that all these people are going to hell and things of that nature, because it just doesn't fit their experience. So
Well, it doesn't fit what they think the church should be representing.
should be
either.
right. Exactly.
And so it makes the
and
church look like a bunch of hypocrites.
And for me, I've kind of, I've been the whole, I mean, I've been in the ministry more than 40 years. This Southern Baptist fight has been my whole ministry, my whole time. I mean,
Lucky
I'm
you.
growing up as a kid, it just wasn't there. And so the fight starts about the time I go into ministry, and some of us have been our whole lives. And so it's painful, and you don't know anything else. And so some people are just tired of the fighting. They just don't want all this fight. And to me, the shift really happened around the late 70s, early 80s, where you had this shift towards politics, and there's sort of a giving up on evangelism. I mean, there's lip service to evangelism, but that was shunted off to the side, and missions. I was again sharing last week where used to at SBC, the Foreign Mission Board report was the big night. It was packed out, and by the end of the by the late 1980s, there was nobody there. So, Ann, did you have a question, or
no?
You need to unmute, Mike. You're still muted.
Go
ahead.
I think another reason why there's less people going to church now is families that are splitting, and there's not the unity of the husband and and the mother would encourage kids to go and give them a good reason to be there.
Breakup of families, yeah, that's definitely part of that. I mean, there's a lot of things. I don't think there's any one thing. There's a number of things, and it's difficult to get, some of that's society trends, and are difficult to really deal with. But it was interesting that at least back in the 70s and 80s, the big saying was conservative churches are growing and liberal churches are declining. Well, now it's conservative churches are declining too. So they're not exempt from that trend. And so I don't see that changing. In fact, it's again, COVID has accelerated all that. Even the church well, just about every church I know of, their attendance is not what it was before COVID. And I think that it's again, it's because those trends were there. It just accelerated it.
Well,
Any other, go ahead, Ann.
Go ahead. Unmute me.
You're not muted.
Oh, another reason I think too is with the COVID, people got out of the habit of going, and they just never gotten back into going either.
They did, or they got in the habit of watching it online or something. And so,
That's what they're doing.
that was the good thing about online is it kept us going during COVID. The bad thing about it, and again, let me say that trend had already started. That was not, I mean, that was not new. That was the trend of watching church only online had started. Again, that was just something that COVID accelerated. And I remember hearing talk of that even before COVID, that one day you would have as big an online group for your church as you would, or if you were going, let me put it this way, if you were going to continue to exist as a church, you were going to have to develop an online presence and audience, because that's where everything was going. And again, COVID just accelerates that and gets that farther than, in other words, it took 2 years to happen where it was going to take maybe 10 or 15 years to happen. Mike?
I just looked up the definition of wokeness, and it covers a whole gamut of subject. It started out of a racism And it's even evolved into the way teachers are teaching students today.
Well,
But it's got a whole gamut of,
yeah, well, actually, it started in the Black community.
yeah, well,
It
that's right.
started as being conscious, not just of racism, but also of abuse of women and standing up for women, standing up for races. And so what I'm going to be honest, it's what we white people do. We take something out of the Black community, we distort it, and we throw it back at them. And so, you know, wokeness is misinterpreted to be something that it originally wasn't. And so same with critical race theory and stuff like that. But again, this is all part of the ball of things we're dealing with. And acknowledging that racism exists is not, to me, wokeness. I mean, it's not a negative thing. It's something we Christians should acknowledge, and it's part of our broken nature.
Well,
And so, but I mean, people can go overboard with that.
Well, that's true. Acknowledging that is true, but it makes us alert to the way society address, especially racism, and the concept of wokeness. And that concept is to try to make people stay angry and stay woke, so to speak. There's a lot of definitions of it.
There's a lot of definitions to that.
My comment relative to that was that, as you said, Mike, if there are a lot of definitions, when any one person uses the term, you don't know what they're meaning.
Well, that's right.
What they think it means. And so I like to avoid language like that is nebulous. You know, you can look up a definition, but you don't know what person A means when they say it versus person B, you know. So it's one of those, and because it's linked to so much of the political agendas, it's just better to,